And one of the standard concerns about having a constitutional convention is that if we have it, only the crazies will get elected, and they will then try to rewrite the entire structure of government. I'm not sure who will get elected, but frankly, given the track record, and I don't mean to sound like I trust the people always to do the right thing. I mean, a lot of the amendments that we've talked about here today are ones that I voted against, and I suspect Steve voted against.
I'm not saying.
Well, just for the record, Steve and I were together on an amicus brief in the case involving the governor's commutation power.
Oh, that's right.
And
we won the case.
We won the case, and the amendment.
And we got overruled by the people.
Okay. So, for whatever that's worth.
I forgot about that.
Right. And we were also together on another case challenging under the federal Constitution the validity of the provision that changed the structure of death penalty appeals in this state. But that's neither here nor there. We got skunked on that one too. But at some level, I guess I don't have a grand sense of what we would do or what we ought to do if we had a constitutional convention in 2013. But I guess I'm also a little more optimistic that some of the people who are worried about what would happen. I mean, I think if the crazies actually took over the convention, there's a pretty good chance that their handiwork would be rejected. Now, if such a convention had as skillful leadership as the 1912 convention, instead of giving us a whole new document, they'd split it up, right? And so maybe some of the really crazy things would get rejected, but there's always the possibility that some crazy things would slip through. Let me give you a couple of examples from the 1912 Constitution. There were provisions coming out of the 1912 convention to grant women the right to vote.
Oh my God.
And another one, since the Ohio Constitution at that time limited the franchise to white males, there was another provision, or another proposed amendment to remove the word white from the franchise provision. Both of them failed. Now, of course, the racial restriction was irrelevant because it had been superseded by the 15th Amendment. But even a progressive convention like the one in 1912 wound up having some pretty strange things result. One more kind of quirky thing. Part of the 1912 convention was actually aimed at reining in courts that had been striking down progressive reform legislation. Indeed, very early in the 1912 convention, Theodore Roosevelt essentially kicked off his presidential campaign with a speech that called for, in effect, a popular vote to overturn controversial judicial rulings. The convention didn't do that. It came up with another convoluted mechanism to try to rein in the courts. It turned out to be a complete fiasco, and it took almost 60 years to get that one out. So conventions may give the people a voice. I think that the ultimate catastrophic vision of a convention doesn't bother me too much, but I am worried that if we do have one, that some strange things will find their way into the document.
Well, let me say just a couple of things about the vote in 2012. I think the question of whether Ohio should have a constitutional convention is not the first question one asks. I think the first question one asks is this: does Ohio need significant constitutional revision? If the answer to that is yes, then the question is a state constitutional convention the best way to achieve those changes? Now, I have no doubt that if we had a constitutional convention and whether your crazies or my crazies or just nice, responsible people got elected, they would find stuff to do. They would keep busy. And there'd be the normal myriad of hot and button issues that they would be asked to address. But the question I still think remains is there a need for fundamental constitutional revision in Ohio? Goodness knows, Ohio has a myriad of economic and social and political problems that it's trying to confront. But it's hard for me to believe, at least, that the Ohio Constitution is operating as an obstacle to addressing those issues. But back in 1912, indeed, the Ohio Constitution was an obstacle. It was something that the courts relied on. The Home Rule advocates found the Constitution to prevent them from managing their cities. The Chamber of Commerce, or the antecedent to the Chamber of Commerce, didn't like the tax structure limitations in it. Labor was unhappy with it, so there was much more of an obstacle, set of obstacles posed by the Constitution. I think the next to last point is that if you're going to have a constitutional convention, you don't just wake up one morning and say, hey, let's have a constitutional convention. It takes preparation, it takes analysis, it takes thought. In the 1950s, the Wilder Foundation commissioned a study, and they did some analysis and some reports. In 1952, the people rejected the call for the Constitutional Convention, but at least some groundwork was done. I don't think any of this groundwork has been done, so I just think that no one has really made the case for a Constitutional Convention. But there is an alternative. In 1969, the Ohio General Assembly approved legislation to create an Ohio Constitutional Revision Commission. That commission began meeting in 71, met for 6 years. The purpose of the commission was to take a good comprehensive look at the Ohio Constitution, and their work was to be used in the event the people voted in favor of a constitutional convention in 1972. The people did not vote for a constitutional convention in 1972, but the commission continued its work, produced a multi-volume set of papers, plus a final report. And what's most interesting is that in the decades since that time, a significant number of constitutional amendments to Ohio, mostly good government type amendments, came out of the work of that bipartisan blue ribbon commission. So the recommendation I made about 4 years ago, which has gotten exactly no traction at all, was that we ought to consider appointing a blue ribbon bipartisan constitutional revision commission to take a deep look at the Constitution. There are lots of obsolete provisions that don't make sense. There are lots of things that require thought and deliberation, and so that's the substantive suggestion that I want to leave us with.
Sounds like a good idea to me.
Okay. See, we agree on too much.
Thank you. Today at the City Club of Cleveland, we are listening to a special program featuring a panel discussion on the Ohio Constitution with Jonathan Entin, Professor of Law and Political Science at Case Western Reserve University, and Entin Steinglass, Professor of Law and Dean Emeritus at Cleveland Marshall College of Law. We will return to our speakers momentarily for our traditional City Club questions. We encourage you to formulate questions for our speakers now and remind you that your questions should be brief and to the point. We welcome all of you here today, especially those who are guests. We hope that you will join the City Club and become active in our ongoing civic dialogue. This Friday, September 3rd, the City Club welcomes Terry Stewart, President and CEO of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and Museum. Next Tuesday, September 7th, the City Club hosts a panel discussion on the Lake Erie Wind Project, featuring Rich Reno, offshore production manager for General Electric, Lori Wagner, President of Lake Erie Development Corporation, and moderated by Richard Stubbe, founding principal for Nortec Energy and fellow for advancement at the Cleveland Foundation. We are pleased to welcome guests at tables hosted by Cleveland Marshall College of Law. Thank you for your support. Now, we would like to return to our speakers for a traditional City Club question and answer period. We welcome questions from everyone, including guests. Holding the microphone today is Special Programs Committee member Ellie Sullivan. Now, our first question, please.